The energy from sugar feels real. That part is not a myth. 30 minutes after a sugary snack, most people do feel more alert, more awake, like something clicked back on. And because that feeling is real, the logic that follows seems sound. Sugar gives you energy, so when you need energy, you reach for sugar. The problem is what happens next. 40 to 60 minutes later, the energy that arrived is gone. Not just back to baseline, often below it. The alertness disappears. A heaviness sets in. Concentration breaks down. Some people feel irritable. Some feel anxious. Some feel an almost physical need for something sweet again. That cycle, the brief lift followed by the crash followed by the craving, is not a character flaw. It is a predictable physiological sequence that follows from how blood sugar regulation actually works. And once you understand the mechanism, you stop wondering why you keep feeling this way and start understanding what to do about it. Let's go through what is actually happening. Every time you eat carbohydrates, whether that is a piece of fruit, a bowl of rice, or a handful of candy, those carbohydrates are broken down into glucose and released into the bloodstream. Blood glucose rises. This is normal. This is how the system is designed to work. The pancreas responds to rising blood glucose by releasing insulin. Insulin is the hormone that opens the doors of cells, primarily muscle cells and fat cells, to allow glucose to enter and be used for energy or stored. As insulin moves glucose out of the blood and into cells, blood glucose levels fall back toward baseline. The size of the insulin response depends on how quickly and how much blood glucose rises. And this is where the type of carbohydrate matters significantly. Whole food carbohydrates, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, contain fiber and other compounds that slow the digestion of carbohydrates and the release of glucose into the blood. The rise is gradual, the insulin response is proportionate, blood glucose returns to baseline smoothly. Refined sugars and processed carbohydrates, table sugar, high fructose corn syrup, white flour, most ultra-processed foods, are digested rapidly. Glucose enters the bloodstream quickly and in large amounts. Blood glucose spikes sharply. The pancreas responds with a correspondingly large insulin release to clear the glucose. And here is where the problem begins. The large insulin response that follows a significant sugar intake is not perfectly calibrated to the amount of glucose present. It tends to overshoot. In the process of clearing the blood glucose spike, insulin drives blood glucose not just back to baseline, but often below it, into a state called reactive hypoglycemia, or a post-sugar glucose dip. Blood sugar drops below the level where the brain and body feel adequately fueled. The brain is the organ most sensitive to blood glucose fluctuations. Unlike most tissues, the brain cannot store glucose and cannot easily switch to alternative fuel sources in the short term. It requires a continuous, stable supply. When blood glucose drops below optimal levels, even briefly, even modestly, the brain registers this as a threat to energy supply and responds accordingly. The symptoms of that response are what most people experience as the sugar crash, fatigue, brain fog, difficulty concentrating, irritability, sometimes a mild headache, sometimes anxiety, sometimes a strong craving for something sweet, which is the brain's attempt to drive behavior that will restore blood glucose quickly. The craving is not weakness, it is a biological drive, the brain signaling urgency to address what it perceives as an energy crisis. And because the fastest way to raise blood glucose quickly is to eat more sugar, the craving specifically targets sweet, quickly digestible food. If the craving is satisfied with more sugar, the cycle repeats. Another spike, another overshoot, another crash, another craving. This is the loop that most people experience as an afternoon of eating without ever feeling satisfied. Not because they lack willpower, but because the biology keeps resetting the starting condition. The mood effects of blood glucose fluctuation deserve more attention than they usually receive. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for emotional regulation, impulse control, and complex decision-making, is particularly sensitive to blood glucose availability. When glucose drops after a sugar spike, prefrontal cortical function declines before many other brain functions are affected. The result is that emotional regulation becomes harder precisely at the moment when most people are experiencing the irritability and anxiety that the glucose drop itself is causing. You feel more irritable. The part of your brain that would normally moderate that irritability is the exact part that is most impaired. The combination produces emotional reactivity that can seem disproportionate to circumstances. Level of frustration or impatience that does not match what is actually happening, but makes complete sense given what the brain chemistry is doing. A 2019 study published in the journal Nutrients followed participants through a high-sugar dietary period and a low-sugar dietary period. During the high-sugar period, participants reported significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety, and fatigue. The relationship was not explained by caloric intake or other dietary factors. It was specific to the glycemic variability, the swings in blood glucose, that the high-sugar diet produced. This finding is consistent with a broader body of research linking glycemic variability to mood instability. People whose blood glucose fluctuates significantly across the day, spiking and crashing repeatedly, report worse mood, lower energy, and poorer cognitive performance than people whose blood glucose remains relatively stable, even when total caloric and sugar intake is similar. The issue is not sugar per se, it is the amplitude and frequency of the spikes and crashes. There is a second mechanism at work here that explains why sugar specifically, rather than other foods, produces such a strong craving loop. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter central to motivation, reward, and habit formation, is released in response to sugar consumption. This dopamine response evolved to reward behavior that led to caloric intake in environments where food was scarce. Sweet taste specifically triggers a stronger dopamine response than most other flavors because sweetness reliably indicated caloric density in the natural food environment. In the modern context, with readily available ultra-processed foods engineered to maximize sweetness and palatability, this dopamine response creates a reinforcement loop. Sugar consumption triggers dopamine release. Dopamine reinforces the behavior. The next time blood glucose drops, the brain has a well-worn pathway directing behavior towards sugar consumption. Over time, repeated sugar dopamine cycles can contribute to a pattern that resembles the tolerance development seen with other dopaminergic substances. The same amount of sugar produces a smaller dopamine response than it initially did, driving consumption of larger amounts to achieve the same reward signal. This is not identical to addiction in a clinical sense, but the mechanistic overlap explains why some people find it genuinely difficult to reduce sugar intake through willpower alone. The neural reinforcement is working against them. A 2013 review in the British Journal of Sports Medicine noted that sugar activates similar neural pathways to other substances associated with habitual consumption, including the nucleus accumbens, the brain's primary reward center. The review described binging, withdrawal, craving, and cross-sensitization behaviors in animal studies that parallel patterns seen with other reinforcing substances. This does not mean sugar is equivalent in harm to more serious substances. It means the craving is neurologically real, not a sign of poor character, and that strategies that address the underlying biology are more effective than strategies that rely on resistance alone. Here is what the research supports in terms of breaking the cycle. The most effective single intervention for reducing glycemic variability is changing the composition of meals rather than restricting food. Specifically, the presence of protein, fat, and fiber at the same meal as carbohydrates significantly slows gastric emptying, the rate at which food leaves the stomach and reaches the small intestine where glucose absorption occurs. When glucose absorption is slowed, the blood glucose rise is more gradual. The insulin response is more moderate. The overshoot is smaller. The post-meal glucose dip is shallower. The crash is reduced or eliminated. This is why the same amount of sugar consumed as part of a meal containing protein and fat produces a different physiological response than the same sugar consumed alone. A candy bar eaten alone produces a sharper spike and a harder crash than a small piece of chocolate eaten after a meal that included protein. The total sugar content is not the only variable. The context in which it is consumed changes the metabolic response. A 2015 study in diabetes care tested the effect of food order on blood glucose response. Participants who ate protein and vegetables before carbohydrates had significantly lower post-meal glucose spikes than participants who ate carbohydrates first. Even though total caloric and macronutrient content was identical, the sequence of eating changed the glycemic response. Vinegar, specifically acetic acid, has been shown in multiple studies to reduce post-meal glucose spikes when consumed before or with a meal. The mechanism involves inhibition of digestive enzymes that break down carbohydrates, slowing glucose release. A tablespoon of apple cider vinegar in water before a meal produces measurable reductions in post-meal blood glucose in both healthy individuals and those with insulin resistance. This is a low-cost, well-replicated finding that applies regardless of the specific meal composition. Physical movement after eating addresses glycemic variability through a different pathway. When muscles contract, they pull glucose out of the bloodstream independently of insulin through a mechanism involving glucose transporter proteins that are activated by muscle contraction itself. A 10 to 15-minute walk after a meal meaningfully reduces post-meal blood glucose spikes, as confirmed by multiple studies including wearable continuous glucose monitor research. This is not about burning calories. The caloric expenditure of a 15-minute walk is modest. It is about the muscle contraction activating a parallel glucose uptake pathway that reduces the demand on the insulin response and flattens the spike. The honest picture of what sugar does to energy is this. The initial lift is real but brief and borrowed. The body brings blood glucose up and then, through normal regulation, brings it back down. When the food causing the rise is high glycemic and the rise is sharp, the correction tends to overshoot, leaving you below baseline rather than at it. The crash is not a failure of willpower. It is the predictable physiological consequence of a sharp glucose rise followed by a proportional insulin response. It happens to almost everyone who consumes high glycemic foods in isolation. The variation between people is mostly in the degree, not the direction. The craving that follows the crash is not weakness. It is the brain correctly identifying that blood glucose is low and generating a drive toward rapid correction. The problem is that the most available correction, more sugar, restarts the cycle rather than resolving it. Breaking the cycle does not require eliminating sugar. It requires changing the conditions under which blood glucose spikes occur through food pairing, meal sequencing, movement after eating, and reducing the frequency of high glycemic foods consumed in isolation. These are not restrictive measures. They are structural changes that allow the system to behave the way it was designed to, with gradual rises and smooth returns to baseline, instead of spikes and crashes that leave you reaching for something sweet every 90 minutes. If this gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening when you hit that afternoon wall, hit the like button, share it with someone who keeps reaching for sugar and wondering why they are still tired.